Have you ever wondered what makes a poem or piece of art special? Is it just a copy of what is in this world, or is there something more? Hello everyone, my name is Arin, and I'll present to you about the 4 approaches of literary art criticism by Abrams, based on his book titled The Mirror and the Lamp. I'll go over each approach generally, and then a bit more in detail based on what I've read in his book. Let's get to it. So, before going into the 4 main theories that the author Abrams discussed in his book, I want to give an introduction. What is the book about? So, this book it will give a understanding about the critical theories. Next is the 4 coordinates or theories of art from the author himself. And he also talks about a little bit of how critics will use these theories in practice. So, understanding critical theories. The book looks at how ideas about art and literature have changed over time. At first, critics saw art as mainly a copy of the outside world. Later on, though, especially during the 19th century, the Romanticism era, they began to see art as a way for artists to express their own thoughts and their own feelings. This change affected how people define, how people study, and how people judge poetry and art itself. Now, the 4 theories or coordinates from the author himself. To understand and judge a work of art, a critic, they must consider these 4 key elements, which the text calls coordinates. First, there is work. It is the piece of art itself, like the poem, the painting, the song, or the sculpture. Second is the artist. It is the creator of the work. Third is the universe. The universe is the world, or the reality that the art refers to, or imitates, or it reflects. And lastly, the 4th one is the audience. It is the listeners, the viewers, or the readers who experience the work itself. How critics use them. While good critics should consider all 4, most art theories show a strong connection, or it tends to lead towards only one of these elements. A critic will usually pick one of the 4 terms as their main focus. And this main focus, it becomes the source for the rule of defining and studying and judging the quality and the value of the art. The first theory is the mimetic theory. This theory is the idea that art is an imitation of the world or reality. It is the oldest and most dominant theory of art criticism, and what it means to imitate has changed significantly over time, leading to 2 main ancient views and several later changes. So, the core definition of the mimetic theory, this theory says that the main role of art is to represent, to copy, or to reflect aspects of the universe, the nature, or human life. Now, there is the divide between Plato and Aristotle. Now, let's look at the 2 most important figures in early literary theory, Plato and Aristotle. They both believe that art is imitation, or mimesis, but they see it in completely different ways. Plato, he thought art was bad imitation. He said art copies the real world, which is already imperfect, so it's like a copy of a copy. Because of that, he believed art takes us further from the truth and can mislead people by playing with emotions. That's why in his ideal world, he wanted to ban poets, since their art could corrupt the mind. But Aristotle, he disagreed. He said art is imitation too, but it's a good kind of imitation, a natural and creative way humans to express themselves. For him, art, especially tragedy, helps us understand human actions and emotions, and it must have a clear structure, like a proper plot. Now, Aristotle's lasting influence, his ideas were very influential because he believed that a good artwork should have a structure and it should have a purpose. For example, in a tragedy, the plot must come naturally from the action or the story being told. Everything should feel connected and feel complete. Unlike Plato, who thought poets created through divine inspiration or emotion, Aristotle, he saw artists as skilled creators. He believed a poet or an artist uses reason, they use technique, they use creativity to shape their work carefully. So in short, art isn't just about feeling or inspiration. For Aristotle, it's about intelligence, it's about craft, and it's about being thoughtful. Redefining imitation. The concept of imitation stayed the same. It stayed central, but its meaning have changed in 3 major ways. So, according to Abrams, imitation became ideal. So, critics like Charles Batoux, in France, he argued that art shouldn't copy everyday life. Instead, it should imitate the beautiful nature, which is an ideal reality the artists create by taking the best traits from many individuals to make something perfect. This provided a single and clear rule to judge all art. Next is the rise of originality. The idea of the original genius came, it praising authors who created new and unique works instead of copying old ideas or old masters. However, even these originals were still said to be imitating nature, just in a more personal and perfect, novel-looking way. The source of inspiration, well, it remained nature. There were also new words for imitation. So critics, they began using many new similar terms, such as reflection or representation and image, meaning they were trying to subtly shift away from the strict and classic definition of imitation. And in the 18th century, this theory it breaks down because critics they started challenging the idea that all of art is imitating something. So Abrams says that Lessing argued that art should be judged by their medium. He noted that painting they imitate things that are fixed in space, like colors and forms, while poetry they imitate like ongoing action, progressive action, like a sequence of sound over time. This showed that a single rule of imitation couldn't apply to everything. Other critics, they divided the arts into imitative arts and non-imitative arts. Imitative arts are like painting and sculptures because they truly imitate. They resemble what they show. And non-imitative arts are like music and most poetry. They are not imitative, they rely on convention, like he says, agreed upon symbols and sounds. And so the focus has shifted. The old focus, it was asking if the art correctly reflected nature or reality. And the newer focus is asking what effect the art had on the audience. In this later view, imitation became just as a tool used by the artist to produce a desired effect, like happiness or sadness in the watcher. The interest moved away from the object being copied and towards the response it gave or it generated. Now we move on to the second theory, which is the pragmatic theory, art for the audience's effect. So the pragmatic theory, it focuses on the audience, not the artist or the artwork itself. According to this view, the value of art depends on how well it affects or influences its audience. Now the main concepts, the definition and the goal. So it views art as a tool. Pragmatic critics see art as simply a tool, an instrument used to influence the audience or make them feel a specific way. While the main goal of art, a concept made by famous Roman critic Horace, is to teach and delight, or to profit and to please. Historically, critics usually view teaching as the final most important goal, with the delight or the pleasure being a necessary step to successfully reach that moral end. Abrams, he also gave many examples. Here is the example of Sir Philip Sidney. The most significant early English example of this theory, the pragmatic theory, is Sir Philip Sidney's The Apology for Poetry from the 1580s. He still called poetry as imitation or mimetic, but the imitation was only a means to the ultimate end of teaching. He puts the position of the poet above the philosopher and above the historian, because the poet combines the moral truth, the philosopher's general idea, with a compelling story, the historian's particular example, to move the audience towards a virtue. That's what is his opinion, his views. Now, this pragmatic theory, it owes a lot to the Roman critic Horace. Horace, he famously said a poet should aim to either profit, teach, or to please, or ideally to blend both the delightful, the pleasure, and the usefulness into one work. Now, this advice, it led to centuries of critics focusing on three main ways art affects the audience. It's to teach, to please, and to move or to persuade. Over time, critics argued over which goal was more important. Early critics thought that teaching was the final most important goal, while later on, the critics, especially in the 1700s, they often decided that pleasure was the ultimate goal and teaching was just a secondary thing. Now the focus. In pragmatic theory, since the goal of art is to create a certain effect on the audience, the focus is on how the art is made. the process, or the techniques behind it. Now, method is key. Pragmatic critics care about the methods and skill that help an artist achieve their goal, whether that's to teach, to entertain, or to move the audience. So they study how the artist uses things like language, structure, or emotion to make the audience feel or think a certain way. And rules. Over time, the successful methods, they become written down as rules. And these rules, they serve two main purposes. They come from observing what worked well in great art from the past, and they're also based on psychological ideas, how people generally react or respond to certain techniques, to certain artistic techniques. So these rules they made, they act as guides. They help the artists while they create new works. They help critics to judge, to evaluate whether a new piece of art is effective or not towards the audience. So this pragmatic theory, it very much centers around the reaction of the audience, and the artists, the writers, they really focus on methods to effectively create a reaction in the audience. And the critics, they also use these rules so that they can evaluate the pieces of art. Now, how does 18th century critics focus on rules and audience's pleasure as the main goals of art? The critic Richard Hurd, he believed that the entire purpose of poetry was to give the maximum possible pleasure. Hurd, he gave an argument. He argued that to figure out the rules of art, you must study how the reader minds work, like psychology. If the goal is to please the reader, the rules must be the means to achieve that pleasure. For him, poetry is simply something enjoyable. Is simply an enjoyable way or method of presenting a subject that people find pleasing. And there's also the critic Samuel Johnson, bridging the theories. The critic Samuel is a great example of a refined pragmatic approach. Through his work begins to hint at later theories that focus on the artwork itself. So Johnson's pragmatic method, he didn't like abstract philosophical theories. He preferred to look at real examples and his own experiences. So the focus on effect, he was pragmatic because he believed the purpose of writing was to instruct by pleasing. The audience is first. Johnson judged a poem's worth based on its success in pleasing its audience. If a work failed to delight the audience, to make them happy, then there was no value in that work, regardless of its other great qualities. Art still needs to imitate reality. Even though Johnson focused on the audience, he didn't completely abandon the old idea that art must imitate nature. Johnson, he praised Shakespeare by saying his plays are a mirror of life, reflecting the basic types of human character. The end of pragmatisms. In summary, pragmatic criticism ruled from time of Horace through the 1700s, always making the audience's need, their pleasure, and the moral instructions, the teachings, the central purpose of the artist and the work itself. And then there's the shift to artist-focused theories. The pragmatic system eventually faded away, giving rise to a new way of judging art. The focus moves from audience to artist. Although critics who focused on the audience were in charge for a long time, they still paid some attention in the artist's natural talent and abilities. Over the 1700s, the small focus grew into something much bigger. The artists, they take over. Attention shifted entirely to the poet's natural imagination, to their emotion, to their genius. The artist's feeling became the most important cause and the very purpose of art. And so this is the birth of Romanticism. This massive change, it created a new orientation in art theory that centers entirely on the artist. And so this connects to the next theory, the third theory, and this new and intense focus on the poet's inner life. Now, the third theory is the expressive theory. Art comes from the artist's feelings. This theory, the expressive theory, is the third major type of criticism based on this book. This theory states that the artist himself is the most important part of the art process. The artwork is the artist's internal feelings made visible. It results from taking the artist's thoughts, their feelings, and perceptions and showing them in the finished product. Wordsworth, as the founder, the year 1800, is considered the starting point for this theory, mainly due to Wordsworth's influence. This marks the moment the focus shifted away from the old theories like from the focus from nature, the focus from the audience, and now it has shifted to the focus of the poet himself. The goal of art is redefined by the artist's need, completely rejecting the purpose set by earlier critics. It rejects old goals. The purpose of art is not caused by imitation. It's not about copying the world, as Aristotle said. It's not caused by the audience's effects, as the pragmatic critic said. Instead, the art is caused by the artist's internal creative imagination, which acts as the art's own source. The sole purpose of the art is to give form to the sincere expression of the feelings and the mental state of the artist, of the creator of expressive theories, artist-oriented by John Stuart Mill. From John Stuart Mill's view, expressive theory can be understood through four main points, all focusing on the artist's inner life. Influenced by Wordsworth, Mill believed that art is the direct expression of the artist's thoughts and emotions. Expressive theory changed how different types of poetry were ranked. Lyric is the purest form of art, the purest art, because it is the most direct expressions of feelings. Other poetry forms like stories or lessons are secondary. They only serve as a stage for the poet to say their feelings. And the world outside of the artist is no longer important. Inner feelings are what matters. If a work just copies objects, it is not poetry at all. And how to judge art? The true measure of art is naturalness and honesty. Being spontaneous. Being spontaneous is best. Mill, he differentiated between natural poetry, born from spontaneous feeling, and poetry that is cultivated, poetry that is studied before. It's written by skill. The spontaneous kind is considered to be superior. And the key question, the most important question for the critic when judging the art based on the expressive theory is it genuine? Is it sincere? Is it the actual state of mind of the poet while composing, while writing it? And lastly is the audience. Expressive theory completely rejects the old idea that art must be made for an audience. Poetry is defined as the poet confessing itself to itself in moments of solitude. The audience is reduced to a single member consisting of the poet themselves. There is no persuasion. If the poet tries to persuade or influence someone else, the work, it ceases to be poetry and becomes like just eloquence or like fancy talking. It is not like a work of art. Wow, it's been a long ride. But wait, I am missing one more theory. So let's move on into the final theory. And now the fourth and final theory, the objective theory, art as the object. The objective theory is the fourth major approach in H. Abrams' book here. In art criticism, it focuses solely on the work of art itself. Now, the historical context, in short, this idea became dominant in the 20th century. It is associated with later critical movements like New Criticism and Formalism. Now, focus on the work itself. It doesn't focus on the artist's feeling anymore, or the audience's reaction, or how well it imitates real life. Instead, it studies how all the parts of a poem or story work together as a complete whole. It judges a piece of art in isolation, based on the internal structure and the qualities of the art, without reference to the artist, to the audience, or to the outside world. So it's only looking at the work itself. Now, Aristotle does have some influence here. So the roots of objective criticism, the idea of objective criticism actually started long ago with Aristotle's Poetics. Even though objective criticism became more popular later on, Aristotle's work already showed some of its key ideas. So at first, Aristotle, he described tragedy as an imitation of human actions, like in the previous theories. However, he later focused on how the parts of the tragedy, such as the plot, the characters, or the diction or the melody, and how they work together to form a complete and balanced whole. So art can be viewed as a structured system, kind of. Aristotle's analysis, it showed that tragedy could be studied as an organized system rather than just a simple imitation of life. And so his contribution, because of this, Aristotle is seen as one of the first scholars, one of the first thinkers to treat art as an independent and structured form, laying the foundation for later views and interpretations of objective criticism. Now, art for art's sake. By the late 18th and 19th centuries, critics began to see art as a world of its own. They believed that art should not try to teach, to preach, or to please, but simply to exist for its own sake. And later, Edgar Allan Poe also supported this idea, saying that a poem should be written solely for the poem's sake. And this belief, it became known as art for art's sake. So you make art just to make art. You have no external purpose to please an audience or to imitate real life, what is happening in the world. You just make art to make art. And now, modern objective criticism, the growth in the 20th century. During the 20th century, objective criticism became one of the main methods used in literary studies. Critics began to focus more on the text itself rather than the author or the reader's feelings. Now, Thomas Stearns Eliot's view. Eliot believed that when we study poetry, we should see it purely as poetry, not as some kind of philosophy or some kind of autobiography or personal confession. He emphasized that the poem should be analyzed as a complete and independent work. Many critics agreed with Eliot's view and highlighted the autonomy of the literary work, meaning it can stand on its own without needing outside explanation or outside. So we've reached the end of my presentation. That is the 4 approaches in literary criticism according to Abrams' model. I hope this presentation has given a basic idea of how literature can be studied and approached in different ways, how it's been viewed, and how the techniques and methods of how it was made. Because literature is not just words on a page, it's a way to reflect, it's a way to connect and explore the human experiences from many different perspectives. So, thank you so much for your attention.